Hi everyone, I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thank you all for tuning in to our fourth discussion in our Cold War Spaces series. Today's topic is Shadow Space, Soviet Secret Cities in Transition. We're joined by Xenia Vytuleva-Herz. She's an architecture historian, theorist, and curator. Right now she's a senior researcher at the philosophy department of the ETH Zurich, and she's joining us from Basel today. She's written extensively on critical preservation, architecture, and knowledge production. She's been awarded numerous grants, including from the Graham Foundation for Zato's Soviet Secret Cities of the Cold War. And today's discussion will be with the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming, Joes Segal. So we'll have the talk for 30 minutes and then open it up to questions from viewers at the end. So get your questions ready and you can type them into the question box, Q&A box during the last 10 minutes of the talk. I'd also like to extend a very special thank you to Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting our discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. So Joes, I'll hand it off to you to get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. Since Thomas More's novel Utopia from 1516, the tradition of utopian literature has produced a whole range of islands and secluded spaces as the backdrop for ideal, or sometimes not so ideal, experimental or alternative communities. Some famous examples are the island of Caliban in Shakespeare's The Tempest, New Atlantis by Francis Bacon, Tommaso Campanella's City of the Sun, The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells, and Aldous Huxley's Island of Pala in his last novel, Island. But what if such fantasies become reality? Since the 1940s, the Soviet Union has built a large number of so-called closed cities, carefully sealed off from the outside world, where, among other things, military, nuclear, and space technology was developed and tested. What do we know about these secret shadow cities? And what can we learn from them, especially now that we are all more or less confined to our own mini-quarantine societies? I'm very happy to welcome my guest, Xenia Vytuleva-Herz, who will shine her light in the darkness. Xenia, welcome. And first of all, can I ask you, what sparked your interest in closed cities? How did it all begin?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Wende, for first of all for this incredible initiative. And I do believe that juxtaposing secret zones of the Cold War with today's situation might open unexpected doors and open up the unforeseen pasts and unforeseen futures, and maybe some interesting questions. There are two reasons why I was so very much seduced by the secret cities. One is, of course, the material culture of secrecy and the blueprints of the maps of secret cities, the urban setting of the secret cities, and I hope we'll have a second to talk about them, that were formed as ideal and utopian entities. And the second one was perhaps even more seductive. It's the nature of the shimmering nature of the secret per se. Because of the shimmering nature of a secret, these cities are balancing all the time on the border of existence and non-existence, and not by chance the study of secrecy doesn't belong to any specific discipline. It frustrates art historians and architecture historians. It absolutely frustrates political scientists, literature theorists, anthropologists, sociologists, because a secret is somehow a promise. It's a promise of a future. And it is balancing on the border of physical and metaphysical, and that's what was particularly interesting and inspiring for me.
Right. So before we maybe go in a little deeper about those philosophical aspects, can you tell us a little bit how closed cities were conceived, what motivated them, and also how are they actually sealed off? How does that work?
Okay, I would love to share some images with you. Well, first of all, behind me is a very interesting cross-disciplinary research of my colleagues Katya Larina and Tatiana Korbachevskaya. It's a map of dangerous dust dispersing in Siberia. And there is a reason why I wanted to start with this image, and because I want to show that the study of secret cities, Soviet secret nuclear cities, is an incredibly complex riddle. It's like a metaphysical puzzle encompassing various layers of meanings. It's an architectural matrix of secret zones, but it's also a Cold War urban phenomenon. Now, it's a network of ghost urban formation. And there were 43 of this ghost urban formation that were established as the nuclear shield of the USSR, 43 in total, and the top 10 super secret, like top secret cities, the strategic 10 they were called. So these are some, they look like ideal cities, like ideal socialist utopian cities. And the network was established in 1946 as a rapid reaction to the double lightning flash of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, just a few months after the tragedy. Mm-hmm. It was literally a one rapid gesture, and that's very important, that the whole network was established as one living organism, something like the intelligence of the octopus, you know, where the brain is dispersed in various parts of the body. And I believe that this belongs to the nature of the secret city. It's never one. It's always a chain. So for instance, here we see the panorama recently declassified. I was very privileged to get to the archives, recently declassified as a secret city, Novouralsk in the Urals. And another side of the story is that its secret is sealed, you know, within the public media. However, it's made out of the concrete, out of the bricks and stones. So it's a mix of tangible and intangible heritage. And for me personally, this is one of the most incredible mixture of scientific research.
And can you tell us maybe a little bit how this secrecy worked? I mean, it's very fascinating that these cities were not to be found on any map, for instance. Were they also surrounded by walls? And what were the measurements the Soviet government took to keep these cities as secret as possible? Also, maybe with regard to family members, if people started to work in those cities, how did they prevent from the message spreading all over the population?
Well, that's a good question. Indeed, these cities had no names, just codes or changing numbers, deleted from maps, obliterated from national statistics. And by the way, the population could be more than 100,000 of each city. So it's not a small format only. So these were, first of all, somehow volunteer prisoners, top nuclear scientists of the country, sometimes even with a small injection of the foreign specialists. And of course, as every city, there was the whole spectrum of the social layers. You know, the supporting bloc, the military bloc. These cities were sealed within the perimeter. Within several months, the 6-meter-high perimeters with the barbed wire and the checkpoints were sealing each of the closed formation. So who built them? That's another interesting question.
Right.
These cities were built by with a strict KGB supervision. the message to establish the secret network as the nuclear shield of the Soviet Union was sent from Stalin to Beria. And the name is not accidental because Beria was responsible for many years. He was responsible for another ghost urban formation, but for the gulags. And so military troops were involved in building, of course, the KGB. The architectural blueprints were coined or designed in the Dnieper Architectural Institute, Research Institute in Leningrad. And there are a lot of anecdotes that are somehow connected with this position, yeah, because each secret city has kind of a signature of the Leningrad style, imperial style, a particularly narrow and very elegant long windows.
Right.
Regardless of the geographical location. So who else built them? The Gulag prisoners, of course, because in most cases, these secret cities just opposed the Gulags and the wartime prisoners. So as we can see, it's already an incredibly complex knot of agencies that are involved in the erection of the secret formation.
Right. So you mentioned these cities look like ideal cities, and it's in a sense not without reason that I started with mentioning the utopian tradition. But a very interesting question then is, how was that experienced by the inhabitants, and did they feel like living in a utopian city, or were there also more dystopian elements, especially now that you are comparing those cities with gulags? And maybe I know you prepared a series of wonderful pictures. Maybe you can show us some images while you're expanding on this. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'll take it as a compliment.
It
so
is.
Yeah, there are a lot of poetic moments that are connected with this secret formation. First of all, in the everyday language, like they were called as mailbox cities or mailbox urban formation. That marks its nature of one-way communication media. And the line that I was born in the mailbox is one of the most, is incredibly common in the cities. And it immediately marks a special status of the resident, being privileged, being in a special position. Yes, it's a non-year space that is non-mentioned on the map, deleted from the map. It's a blank account, or it's covered by the blue, depths of the lake in most cases. The waterfront kind of camouflaged the spaces, but it was an incredible privileged position for the scientists. There were about 2 generations that were raised behind the perimeter that allow us also to speak about a specific secret city resident psychology. So the anthropologists and psychologists are actively working in collaboration with us these days. So it's a very interesting mix.
Right. And first of all, since these cities were more or less conceived in the same way, and they almost look like copies of each other sometimes, you wonder whether the cultural and social life in those cities also evolved around the same patterns, or was that very different? And please show us some examples from your PowerPoint. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So this is one of the plans of a secret city, Sverdlovsk 44, that changed its name like 3 or 4 times, and it's finally called Novouralsk.
Yeah, can you use a share screen so that we can see it?
Oh, I'm not sharing it? I'm so sorry.
No,
Okay. I'm so sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. And full screen. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So
There
this
we
is
go. Perfect.
The utopian image, the utopian city. As we can see, it has the clear influence of the green city. And here are some images. I'll go backwards. Of the same city, but in reality. So this is Novorossiysk, the secret city Novorossiysk that looks like a perfect communist test ground, and we'll return to this in a second, because for the outsiders, for those who lived behind the perimeter, on the other side, like in this conflict shoreline that were not included in the perimeter, there were rumors that Stalin was testing communism in this secret urban formation. So this is definitely the socialist utopia. This is a fantastic example of shadow modernism. It's a stadium that's called Kedr. It was recently demolished in Novorossiysk, and because of its secret status, we actually were losing this shadow modernism. We're losing this experimental architectural practices. I want to draw your attention to the car here. This is the black Volga, and it's not coincidental because most of the cars in that cities were actually black Volgas, signifying and signaling the special status of the city, because there were so many generals and so many military, high-positioned people in the city that only black Volgas were circulating within them, almost. We also can declassify now, or we have some access to the declassified panoramas of the secret cities. For instance, this is again Novorossiysk back then in the 60s and today. Yeah, the comparison. Everything is just recently declassified. It's very fresh.
Right.
And I just wanted to show you this image in order to return us to the story of actually building in concrete and brick and stones. You know, that it was a very material reaction to the tragedy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was an immediate gesture, and within several months, 43 cities, urban formations started to be, emerging on the surface of Soviet Union, and that's an incredible manifestation of architecture as a powerful discipline and as a political discipline, of course.
Right. So maybe also with an eye on the time, one of the, I think, very intriguing aspects is how these cities were viewed from the outside. And you are a trained art historian, and you mentioned some connections with works by Kabakov. Also in literature, the Strugatsky brothers, in film Tarkovsky with Stalker. Could you expand a little on those artistic responses to closed cities? How far were they responses and how do they relate?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very dear question to me, because secrecy needs to be translated to different disciplines. It's just craving to be translated, and it was actually an immediate reaction towards these rumors by the Strugatsky brothers and by Stanislav Lem, and Tarkovsky is, here are the some more images. I'm getting to Tarkovsky now. Tarkovsky's inspiration with the idea of the secret and magnificent zone that can magnify, that he explains it, that it is like a magnifying glass yeah, that can make everything possible. So this, of course, this was the inspiration by the secret cities. And he also speaks about it, that the zone demands respect, otherwise it'll punish you. So these are the codes extracted from the vocabulary of the secret cities. And this is very interesting for me, how across the disciplines, across the borders of secrecy, the ideas are still growing. And of course, this shows us the unforeseen futures and the unforeseen moments of of the secret formation. How would they evolve in the future? So Tarkovsky's zone is in Stalker, has its agency. Yeah, it can accept people coming in, or it can refuse people coming in. And there is a very interesting anecdote about, actually very disturbing anecdote about how the locals from the neighboring villages were perceiving these spaces, and how could they get in? And they could get in only in some desperate cases, when a child in the neighboring village was dying, for instance, and they needed an extreme care of a good doctor in a very good hospital. And in this case, this perimeter could be penetrated. And so the locals were cured in the zone and returned back from these mysterious zones with a package of rumors. So, and I would say that the mist around the city plays a very specific role. One more image that I want to share with you is the work of Alexander Kommer and Victor Milamide. It's called Secret Spaces, and it's dated in 1972. And how do we perceive in this case a secret space? It's a neo-Palladian villa and it's a factory in an incredible landscape, like the paradise-like landscape that produces nothing else but stunningly beautiful blue cloud, non-stop, 24/7 blue cloud. And of course, it is also a signature of this translating secrecy and translating danger and the production of death into a completely different territory.
Right, very interesting, yeah. So you might expect that with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991, all these closed cities maybe came to an end and opened up, but I was very surprised to read and hear from you that that was not always the case, not so much because the Russian government wanted to keep these cities going, but because the inhabitants didn't want to leave their privileges or give up their privileges and wanted to keep those cities closed. Can you expand a little on that?
Yes, thank you. It's a very good point. I want to show you one image. This is how these places were deleted and very recently on the maps, like black striping, for instance. This is a very interesting image by Katya Larina. It's a perimeter of the secret city Novouralsk. And in 1989, in 1991, the authorities of Novouralsk issued this call for a most creative decoration of the perimeter. And we know that the residents of the secret cities were scared to death of losing their perimeters because these were signs of their exclusiveness and protection. So what happened? I was wondering all the time, what were these images that would appear on the storefront, and which side of the city would it be? And strangely enough, the images were only on the inner side of the city. So the outer side would remain anonymous and gray. And also the images were so intimately romantic, so incredibly sincere and powerful. So what could we see? We could see exotic animals as here, or we could see romantic landscapes, all in the mists with the clouds, with the attributes of the era of the sublime. So for the residents, this perimeter became or was transformed into the sacral wall, into kind of an altar wall, where they could reflect their imaginations, their wishes, and everything that was connected with the better world for them, wherever they thought it was.
So, and they didn't want to give up that better world and more or less use these images to keep themselves embedded in this imaginary community feeling sealed off from the outside world. Is that a way of interpreting these wall decorations?
Well, one of the ways, but of course we have to admit that these were practical paradises during the Soviet Union, with an entirely different good supplies and entirely different health system, and the grass was greener and the sky was more bluish, and so as Walter Benjamin would have put it, these were very well ventilated utopian cities. So of course it was privileged to be a resident there.
Right, yeah, usually the grass is greener with the neighbors, but in this case, it's the other way around. That's really nice, yeah. So, Xenia, another question that came up while preparing for this conversation is if you can see any parallels between closed cities and our self-induced, so to speak, or coronavirus-induced quarantine situation. Is there anything we can learn from the experiences in closed cities?
Well, of course, I have my take on it. And I have to say that we are exchanging our ideas with other experts on the secret cities and secret zones, military zones, because this is definitely an old military trick to have such zones sealed, identical, and this was practiced in Wuhan, for instance, with the first cases of the corona, how immediately they were sealed, they were classified even, and they were treated more or less with the same efficiency and the same methodology as the nuclear cities. But I would like to maybe to open it up to a wider audience.
Yeah, that's the perfect time to do it. It's exactly 12:30. And thank you. And we already have 2 questions in the Q&A, or a number of questions. So I just start with them. Here is Bruce Hollihan, who asked, what would be the differences and similarities with places such as Zhelezhnogorsk, Krasnoyarsk, Krai, and somewhere in the USA like Dugway, Utah? Yeah.
What would be the similarities and
differences and similarities? But yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
It's a great question. Well, of course, it was the same response to the same tragedy. I would say, and the principle of building such cities identical to each other, like cut and paste, copying each other, is a military principle that was practiced on both sides behind the Iron Curtain. But in this case, I would prefer the term the nylon curtain. Yeah, that is quasi-transparent, and that kind of more unites this oppositions of this binary world. What is the major difference for me? I would say is the sense of romanticism, is the sense of an incredible sensitive perception of secrecy and of secret zonings inside of the Soviet Union. And that would be reflected in architecture, because strangely enough, it would be one of the most incredible cases for architectural practices. that would never be open up for the entire world, and that is a paradox. This is a paradox of secrecy. It's incredibly precious, but it's sealed. But it is also the question of kind of a community. You know, it's a different kind of community. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So another question comes from Anne Bobrov-Hayal, and she asks, did people from scientists to construction and other workers spend their entire lives in the secret cities? Were they able to leave to visit their homes outside, and were their children able to leave?
Well, that's a great question. Most of the construction workers were gulag prisoners. And in most cases, they had a possibility to stay, and their children were trying to assimilate with the community of the secret cities, but I don't recall such cases. There was always kind of a separation and social separation, yeah. In case of the important workers, of course, they were able to leave, but they didn't want to live. They were fighting to stay, you know, by marrying somebody or by some personal connection with the military authorities, because it was prestigious, because it was on the other platform.
And are there examples where families over several generations live in these closed cities? You almost get an association with the Truman Show there. Or, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and the residents of the secret cities are of a special kind because of the intensity of the highly educated people, because the amount of the musical school in the secret cities is comparable to huge megapolises, you know, for instance, or dancing schools or chess players. So it is really kind of a stalker environment for very selective, sophisticated souls and brains, and that requires a different optics to look at it.
Right. The next question comes from Sergei Tereshenko.
Oh, that's my student.
Great.
He's a genius student. Thank you.
So he asks,
I love the university.
Nice. He asks, I'd like to ask how today's urban planning in Russia use transparency and secrecy to elevate the status of its residents. Is secrecy itself seductive? Is there any phenomenon similar to these secret cities in Putin's Russia?
Oh, what a provocative question. Well, these cities are still in operation. They are still classified. In order to get to the secret cities, you need to show the Russian nuclear atomic agency that you are reliable, and it's incredibly difficult for the Russian citizens. You have to wait for a visa. So I would say that the cities remain the dots that are connecting lines. Anything else? Well, some of them were transformed, strangely enough, into the new bodies of knowledge. Let's put it this way, into the computer knowledge, into the biological experiment, and they are still in operation.
Okay.
Yeah, secrecy and seductive.
Thank you. Here is a question from Yelena Zaitseva. I'm thinking about a recent project by Ilya Kurzhanovsky, DAO. The whole project and the series of films are about a secret institute in a secret city. It's built on the notion of violence and oppression as a norm in such cities. Could you elaborate on that?
Thank you.
Do you know this project, DAO?
I know the project.
Yeah.
I know, and I think these are parallel stories. They have a lot in common, but I would still use a different optics to unfold the powers of the secret cities. I think it's much more poetic. It's much more about the unforeseen possibilities and powers of the secret nuclear cities. Is about also the discrepancies of the misinterpretation of the nuclear communities. So I wouldn't crisscross them, but it can become an interesting project. So thank you.
Right. Next question is from Rick Bell from Columbia University, and he asks major urban centers, whether Moscow, Leningrad, New York, or Zurich, are seen as attractive, dynamic, and full of the perks coming from culture, cuisine, and power. Why would scientists and generals want to be isolated in these secret cities? That's a nice one.
It's a very nice one. Why would Stalker go and try to drag super brains and superpowers and super talents to the wasteland? Because that's how Tarkovsky was describing the zone, the magical landscape that capable of transforming the human beings. I would say that these were, first of all, secular monasteries for the knowledge production, with all the possible and impossible conditions for the unique knowledge transference. And secrecy is one of the conditions of strategic knowledge transference. So it's one of the must. It's impossible to work on this level of efficiency and speed within larger structures of megapolises. Even though in the very first, that's actually a very good hint, the very first weeks and months of the nuclear production in the Soviet Union, before the erection of the secret cities, the experiments were conducted in the big laboratories in Moscow and next to Moscow.
Right. Okay. So now we go to Liane Schirmer, who asks, your comments on arts training are fascinating. Did anyone who grew up studying the arts in those cities end up at the Bolshoi or the Mariinsky or in theater, etc.? In other words, did they actually leave those cities after their training to become part of the cultural worlds of cultural centers in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, well, it wouldn't be a secret to say that brain drain from the cities is enormous. And it's a brain drain to the major universities of the world, Harvard, MIT, Juilliard, School of Ballet and Music. So yes, indeed, absolutely. These selected communities, selected brains are now dispersing around the world and bringing knowledge to other territories.
Right, so a connected, somewhat connected question comes from Isolta Poggi, who asks, did these cities have university and did they offer all kinds of disciplines?
Yes, there were universities in the secret cities with a very high level of professorship. And however, most of the talented students did go to Moscow State Universities and other central points, central spaces in the Soviet Union, and then returned back. So that could be also the dynamic of the scientists. Yes, there were most of the disciplines were presented. But what is really fascinating that these were not only like hardcore scientists, yeah, these were also poets, and the poetic ingredient is incredibly active within the secret cities. These were artists, were architects. So I would say talents grew across the disciplines. Thank you.
Great, okay. Here we have a question from Dimitri Tsadorin. Urban planning developed in the Soviet Union in certain stages. Were there any specific qualities of closed cities except their secrecy? In other words, would you end up with the same history of Soviet urban planning if you used secret cities as a case study?
That's a very, well, first of all, I have to introduce Dmitry Zadorin, who is an expert in standardization in urban planning in the Soviet Union. And I'm very privileged to have him among the guests here. Well, thank you for the question. Of course, the intersection of secrecy and architecture has its tricks. And the quasi-standardized facades or urban planning settings turn to be in reality untraceable, because what is the standardized? What does it mean being standardized in the Soviet Union? You know it better than anybody else, that it means that architecture is being transparent. It's being transparent also to the espionage. It's like an open book, so you can trace you can trace the layout, you can trace the plans, and that was against the policy of the Cold War, let's put it this way. Right. So architecture did, in the paradoxes of secrecy, let's put it this way, the paradoxes of secrecy were particularly interesting in urban planning. So they were as if they were quasi-similar. They were quasi-Stalinist, but the setting was a little bit different. They were quasi-modernist. They were modernist, but the layout was a little bit transformed. Also to disorient in the spies, the Western spies. Right. So we can talk about it later.
No, sure. And let me see. Maybe again, in view of the time, and this happens every week so far, which is actually great. There are so many more questions than we have time to answer. But I want to finish with Donald Keenan, who asks, what happened after the dissolution of the Soviet Union? Were the cities abruptly defunded and depopulated? I think that's an interesting point, because we spoke a little bit about people wanting to stay in those cities and keep their privileges. But was that actually possible, or what happened to the funding of these cities?
Well, they're still privileged and funded, well funded, most of them. Of course, the difficult time came with the perestroika, where there was this disorientation in politics, and but today the cities managed somehow to redirect themselves or to make important connections, even though there are question marks of opening up the closed cities. Residents are absolutely against of opening up, and it's, I would say, it has severe consequences. So how can we open up a closed city? It's
right.
A topic for a different discussion.
Well, Xenia, this was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for informing us on such an intriguing and interesting topic. It was wonderful to have you here. For next week, my guest will be Ole Baumann, who is the founding director of Design Society in Shenzhen, China. And we will talk about expanding space, design, and emancipation in China. I hope to see you next week as well. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.